Cuckoo, Kachoo everybody, Coach Rap here. I'm going to give you another weight loss lesson. This one is going to be all about carbohydrates. Now, carbs are not necessarily the enemy, but if you are trying to lose weight or manage your weight in any shape or form, then keeping an eye on what you're doing with your carbohydrates is very, very important. What's measured is managed, as they say. Now, carbohydrates, the body does use them as a fuel source. We also store them in the muscles. We store 2/3 of our carbohydrates as glycogen in the muscles. Now, carbohydrates do have a relationship with water. Therefore, when we manipulate our carbohydrate in any shape or form, it does have a direct link on the scales in terms of weight, which we need to distinguish between weight and fat, but we'll get to that. So ultimately, carbs, when they're stored in the muscle, they hold their weight 4 times in water. They're like sponges for water. So it's why when you go low carb or no carb, basically when you strip the carbs from the body, you lose a lot of water retention too, and that's why you can get some incredible weight losses. Originally, when the Atkins diet came in, and the keto was like the grandchild of Atkins, if you like. When Atkins first came in, people were losing crazy amounts of weight each week, and that is because of the water weight that's lost, as well as the carbohydrate loss, as well as the fat loss that then comes from it. So when we consume carbohydrates ultimately get broken down into sugars. You get complex carbohydrates and simple carbohydrates, sugars basically. They come into the body. Now, depending on how complex that food is, the carbohydrate energy source will get released either fast or slow. Now, when this sugar enters the bloodstream, there is a hormone known as insulin that then rises to manage your blood sugar levels. Now, insulin is a builder hormone. So if we are trying to watch what we're doing with our weight or initiate fat loss, we want to keep insulin levels to a minimum where possible. Okay, carbohydrates and sugars are also a very fast energy source for our muscles. So if you're going to do anything that's to be quite dynamic and you need fast energy, then carbohydrates is your body's preferred fuel source in the moment, because it can get it quite quick and get a good burst. Which is why managing your carbohydrate intake is important if you're wanting to lower your body fat. So I'm going to give you a bunch of different tips that you can do, or different approaches that you can do with your carbohydrates in order to lose weight. So first and foremost, I said before, what's measured is managed when it comes to your carbohydrates. So you have to lower them somehow, right? So going for one source of carbohydrates per day is a nice way of putting your carbs into a box and making sure that you're not consuming too many. Okay, so one source of carbohydrates per day is a bit of a win. Carbohydrate source wise, if you make a fist, roughly the size of a fist on your plate. Now, ideally, not all carbs are chosen equal or are created equally. So depending on your choice of carbohydrates would fall into that category. So if you go for things like rice, pasta, couscous, the starch of your carbs and the portion size is roughly the size of your fist, then you'll get the result you're looking for. Another approach you could do with your carbohydrate is known as doing carbs after intense exercise. Now, when you do intense exercise, there's something released into the system called AMP kinase, which in turn stimulates the GLUT4 pathway. Now, GLUT4 is like a magnet in the muscles for pulling sugars out the blood into the muscle without stimulating an insulin response. So I said earlier, insulin's a builder hormone. So if you do intense exercise, you can pull the carbohydrates into the muscle without triggering the insulin response, which in turn keeps the builder hormone to a minimum. So if you're doing if you're planning to have some carbohydrates, for example, you thought, right, I want to have my carbs. If you do a hard workout first, the sugars from those carbs will make it to the muscles where they're needed for energy and the repair, etc., without creating that insulin spike, which will be detrimental to your weight loss goals. So carbs after intense exercise is another approach you could do. Now, low or no carbs is also an approach. It's not one that I teach, only because I try to teach the things that I do personally, and I personally struggle going very low carb. I can do it for a period of time. I can't do it for very, very long because it stresses me out. But there are a lot of people that get good benefits from that. So low or zero carb then stimulates keto. or ketosis if you like, when basically your body starts using ketones for energy. It can be very stressful to some people, but there's a small percentage of people that love it. And basically their diet then consists of medium protein but very high fats. The reason they don't go too high with the protein is that if you go very, very high protein and you don't use all the protein required, your body can then take that protein and via a process known as gluconeogenesis create carbohydrates from the protein and pull you out of ketosis. But fundamentally, going very, very low carb, if not zero carb, for a period of time can put you into ketosis, and then you're using fat and ketones as your chosen source of energy. So that is something else you can do with carbs. It's not one that I choose to do, but it's certainly a path that you can do. Now, when I said earlier about carbohydrates and the sugars from the carbs releasing to the bloodstream, there's a chart you can look into called the GI index, which is the glycemic index, and it measures all carbohydrates based on how quickly the sugars from that carb gets to the bloodstream. So another approach you could do with your carbohydrates is to lower the GI value and go for something either 60 below, or the even challenging thing is 50 below. So there'll be a bunch of foods on that GI index, glycemic index, that you won't be allowed to touch, and then choosing only the foods that create a smaller insulin response. So you'll see, based on that chart, there'll be a bunch of foods that'll be out, but there'll be a bunch of foods that are acceptable. That's another approach you could do with your carbohydrates. Now, one of the methods that I choose to do with carbohydrates is known as carb cycling. So carb cycling takes advantage of the fact that we store so much carbohydrates in the muscles, but we also burn them off much like fuel in a car, so your levels can fluctuate. Now, basic carb cycling will have low, medium and high carb days, and then what it does is it sort of tricks the body into what energy source it's going to use. Now, I personally, the way I do this, I go Monday to Friday low carb. So for me, that means protein, lots and lots of vegetables, but no starchy carb, no carb source. From Monday to Friday, and then on Saturday I have 2 or sometimes 3, depending on which method I'm doing, 3 carb meals, or 3 portions of carbs, 1 at each meal, to fill the muscles back up with carbohydrates, to then reduce them again the following week. So I go low carb, carb up, low carb, carb up. Now the carb up, what it does for me and for most people, is it takes away the brain fog that can occur when you're low carb for long periods of time. It gives me a bit of a boost. It kind of gives the muscles a fuller look, gives me a lot of energy, and I can then utilize that energy. So throughout the week, as I'm doing my workouts, sort of burning off that glycogen as I go, and then later on in the week, basically when I'm very low carb and I've burned all the glycogen off, and then all I'm running on is fat, basically, I only have a few days before I then have to carb back up again to get the results I'm looking for. So carb cycling is a method that you can do. Now, for vegetarians and vegans, it's very, very tricky when you're looking at your carbohydrate sources, because they will be directly linked with your protein sources, and we know that for weight loss we do need to increase our protein. So one of the easiest ways for vegetarians or vegans to manage their carbohydrates is to look at it from an overall calorie approach and reduce your calories by 10%. Now, one of the ways to do this is just grab a smaller plate. Whatever size of plate you have, you grab a smaller plate and then make a mountain on it. Your subconscious will look at the plate. If it's a large plate going to a small plate and then it's only a 10% change in calories, the smaller plate will look like a mountain of food. It will convince your subconscious that you're eating more, when actually you should obviously calculate it as roughly 10%. Now, I know that weighing out food and things can be a bit of a pickle, but if you just look at how much you would have normally put on your plate and do 10% less onto a smaller plate, it will create a big mound, and that is also another good approach for carbohydrates. So the carbohydrates that we've covered are different approaches. We have covered one source of carbs per day. We've covered low carb and no carb. We've covered reducing the GI score of them, so basically just your choice of carbohydrates changes. We've talked about carb cycling, and we've also talked about the reducing the overall percentage, so basically 10% less of your carbs. Now, these are some of the key methods that you can employ if your goal is weight loss. Now, remember, if your goal is not weight loss, your concerns are absolutely different, but this is the different methods that you can choose, and it's important to know that it's different for you. What works for you might not work for the other person, and vice versa. As I said earlier, to do with going keto, for example, I personally struggle with that, but there are people out there that love it and get great results from it. Find the version or management of carbohydrate that works best for you for your goals. Take a breath, it's summer, summer.